Chapter 1. Miren remembered the conversation with Uncle Aldous so clearly it felt as though it had happened yesterday, not 3 weeks ago. "You are not my niece by blood," he had told her, sitting across from her at the modest wooden table in their home on the outskirts of the kingdom. His face had been more serious than she had ever seen it. "You are the daughter of King Alric and Queen Ilsa. You have a twin brother. His name is Edric. He ascended the throne 3 months ago, after your parents died." Miren remembered the way the ground had seemed to vanish beneath her feet. Everything she had known about her life, simple, ordinary, understandable, had suddenly become a carefully constructed lie, hiding something far greater than she could ever have imagined. "Why?" she had asked. It was the only word she had managed to force past her dry throat. "Why was I hidden?" "The prophecy," Aldous had answered quietly. A seer foretold that one of the twins would betray the crown, while the other would save it. The council decided to separate you, so that at least one child would remain safe, no matter what fate had in store for the other. Now, 3 weeks later, Miren stood at the servants' entrance to the royal palace, dressed in a plain gray maid's gown, a worn bundle of personal belongings clutched in her hands. She was about to enter a world that belonged to her by blood just as much as it belonged to the brother she had never met. "Remember," Aldous said, standing beside her in the shadow of the servants' wing. "Here, your name is Myra. You are an ordinary maid, newly hired to serve in the Eastern Wing. No one must even suspect who you really are, unless there is absolutely no other choice." "I understand," Miren said, though her heart was pounding at the thought of what lay ahead. "Stay in the shadows. Watch. Listen," he continued. "If the rumors of a conspiracy are true, your presence here may one day save your brother's life. Until then, you are simply a servant, nothing more." Miren nodded, adjusted the plain kerchief covering her hair, and stepped through the servants' entrance, leaving behind the last remnants of her old, uncomplicated life. The first thing that struck her inside was the sheer scale and luxury of the palace, so different from the modest house in which she had spent her entire life. High ceilings, gilded molding, endless corridors covered in carpets, each of which probably cost more than everything she had ever owned put together. The housekeeper of the Eastern Wing, a stern woman named Griselda, gave Miren a critical once-over before handing her a list of duties: making beds, cleaning chambers, delivering trays of food, and running small errands for the court ladies who lived in that part of the palace. "Don't linger in the corridors without a reason," Griselda warned her, "and stay away from the main halls unless you are specifically ordered there. Ordinary maids have no business being where matters of state are decided." Miren nodded, though a voice inside her whispered that sooner or later, that was exactly where she would need to be if Aldous was right about the conspiracy. She threw herself into her work with the same diligence that had defined her all her life. She made beds, dusted expensive furniture, and carried breakfast trays to noblewomen who woke late after the previous evening's entertainments. By noon, while carrying yet another tray through the eastern corridor, she collided, quite literally, with a tall man in the uniform of the royal guard who rounded the corner with the same haste she herself had been in. The tray slipped from her hands. Only the man's lightning-fast reflexes prevented disaster. With one precise movement, he caught it before it hit the floor, without spilling so much as a drop from the cup of hot herbal tea. "I'm so sorry," Miren said, heat rushing to her cheeks at the embarrassing mishap. "My fault," the man replied, straightening and handing the rescued tray back to her. "I was in too much of a hurry, wasn't watching where I was going." Miren finally looked at him properly. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with short dark hair and gray eyes that studied her with a direct, searching intensity far stronger than their accidental meetings seemed to warrant. "Captain Rogan," he introduced himself, noticing her curious look. "And you must be new. I don't remember seeing you among the Eastern Wing staff before. Myra, she replied, remembering Aldis's warning about her false name. I started this morning. I see. Rogan's gaze lingered on her face a moment longer than simple politeness required. Well then, Myra, welcome to the palace. I hope the work doesn't prove too exhausting. Thank you, Captain, she said, sinking into a slightly awkward curtsy. He nodded and continued on his way. Miren walked in the opposite direction, but after several steps, she caught herself glancing back over her shoulder for one last look at the captain of the guard. To her embarrassment, she discovered that he had done the same. Their eyes met across the length of the corridor for a brief moment before both quickly looked away, as though caught doing something they could not quite explain. Strange, Miren thought, continuing on with her pulse slightly faster than before. She immediately blamed it on the nerves of her first day in a new place. Certainly nothing more. She got her first chance to see the king from a distance that same evening, when Griselda sent her on an errand to a gallery overlooking the inner courtyard. Edric had just returned from a ride and was dismounting his horse, surrounded by a small retinue. Miren froze beside the window, the bundle of linens in her arms forgotten, her eyes locked onto the brother she was seeing for the first time, not on a coin or in a formal portrait, but alive, breathing, real. He was tall, as she was, with the same dark hair she saw in the mirror every morning, and the same line to his jaw that shaped her own face. A strange, unsettling sense of recognition swept over her. It was like looking at a distorted male reflection of herself in another body. My brother. Unexpected tears burned behind her eyes. This was the person with whom she had shared their mother's womb, yet whom she did not know at all. They had been separated by fate, and by the decision of a council whose members were now long forgotten. Edric, unaware of her presence, laughed at something one of his companions said. The sound was light and carefree, and somehow it seemed hauntingly familiar to Miren, as though an echo of her own laughter had come from someone else's lips. She remained by the window for a long time, watching him, before forcing herself to return to her interrupted duties. Her heart was still racing from the strange, overwhelming emotion of that first silent meeting. That evening, having finished her duties earlier than usual, Miren decided to explore the garden of the Eastern Wing, a small, peaceful place where few servants wandered at such a late hour. She had not expected to find anyone else there, so she nearly cried out when she came upon the familiar figure of Captain Rogan sitting on a stone bench, his expression thoughtful as he watched the first stars appear in the evening sky. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't realize anyone was here. I didn't mean to disturb you." "You didn't." Rogan looked up at her with the hint of a surprised smile. "To be honest, I wouldn't mind the company after a long day of reports and investigations." Miren hesitated. Caution told her she should excuse herself and leave, considering why she was really in the palace. Getting too close to the captain of the royal guard was hardly wise. And yet, there was something in his voice, an absence of the authority and arrogance she had already noticed in so many at court, that made her stay. "Investigations?" she asked carefully, taking a seat at the opposite end of the bench and leaving a respectful distance between them. "That sounds rather more serious than the ordinary duties of a guard captain." Rogan studied her for a long moment, as though deciding how much he could safely tell a maid he had met only that morning. "Perhaps," he said evasively. "Let us simply say that things at court are not quite as peaceful as ordinary subjects might like to believe." Miren felt her heartbeat quicken at the implication. Could he be talking about the very conspiracy she had been brought here to uncover? "I hope it's nothing too serious," she said carefully, trying not to reveal too much interest. "Who knows?" Rogan replied, turning his gaze back toward the stars. "Sometimes the greatest threats hide in the places you would least expect to find them." They sat in silence for several more minutes. Strangely, it was a comfortable silence, without the awkwardness that usually came with speaking to someone barely known. "You shouldn't be out here alone this late, Myra," Rogan finally said. His gaze returned to her with the same direct, searching intensity she had noticed when they first met in the corridor. "The palace is not always a safe place for people who wander its halls unaccompanied after dark." "I'll be careful, Captain," she replied with a faint smile as she rose from the bench. "Though I have to admit, I feel much safer in your company than I would alone." The words escaped before she had time to consider how bold they sounded. A traitorous blush warmed Miren's cheeks. Rogan seemed equally caught off guard by the admission. For a moment, his eyes lingered on her flushed face, with an expression that held surprise and something warmer, before he regained his composure. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "I should escort you back to the servants' quarters. It would be unfortunate if such a charming new maid got lost in the palace corridors on her very first night." Miren felt her heart skip a beat at the simple but unmistakable compliment. And to her own embarrassment, she realized she had no objection at all to being escorted. No objection to spending a few more minutes beside this man, whose gray eyes seemed to notice far more than one might expect from the captain of the guard. "I'd appreciate that," she said, accepting the arm he offered with the same uncertain but genuine warmth that had shaped their entire unexpected conversation in the quiet palace garden. They walked through the palace corridors in a silence that was comfortable and yet charged with something neither of them acknowledged. And as Miren stole occasional glances at the profile of the man beside her, a troubling realization slowly took root. Her time in the palace might become a far more complicated trial than merely watching for signs of a conspiracy. It might become a trial of her own heart, a heart that was already beginning to respond to the presence of a man whose existence she had not even known about when she woke that morning. Chapter 2. The day settled into a familiar routine. Miren woke with the bells at dawn, carried out the duties assigned to her, watched and listened just as Aldous had instructed. Yet more and more often, her thoughts returned to that evening conversation in the garden, and to Captain Rogan's gray eyes, which had looked at her with a directness she had never encountered in any man before. On her third day of service, chance brought them together again. This time, under circumstances far more important to the true reason she had come to the palace. Miren was delivering fresh linens to the chambers of Lord Cassian, one of the king's most influential advisors, when she noticed a half-covered sheet of parchment lying on his writing desk. It was filled with coded writing, strange symbols clearly meant to conceal the message from any casual glance. She froze for a moment, torn between caution and curiosity, before allowing herself a closer look. Her memory automatically began fixing the unusual symbols in place. Among the many courtly skills Aldous had taught her years ago, she remembered something similar, an outdated diplomatic cipher used only for the most secret correspondence. The sound of approaching footsteps made her quickly step away from the desk and pretend to be entirely absorbed in making the bed, but not before she had memorized enough of the symbols to reproduce them later. Lord Cassian entered the room and cast her a quick, appraising glance, before hurriedly slipping the parchment into a desk drawer. The movement seemed far too nervous for a man who had nothing to hide. "Finish up here," he ordered sharply. "I have urgent business." Miren nodded, quickly completed her work, and left the chambers with her heart pounding. If her suspicions were correct, she had just stumbled upon the first real thread of the conspiracy she had been brought to the palace to uncover. Finding Rogan proved more difficult than she expected. The captain of the guard seemed to be constantly occupied with duties spread throughout the enormous palace complex. She did not find him until evening, in the training yard, where he was observing several young guardsmen with the same focused seriousness that seemed to define everything he did. "Captain," she said, waiting until there was a pause in the training. "May I speak with you, privately, if possible?" Rogan looked at her with obvious surprise. It was a bold request from an ordinary servant, but something in her voice must have convinced him that the matter was serious, because he nodded and led her away from the other guards. "What happened, Myra?" he asked quietly. Miren chose her words carefully, making sure not to reveal more than necessary about the source of her suspicions. She told him what she had seen in Lord Cassian's chambers, the encrypted document, and the advisor's nervous reaction when he entered the room. Rogan listened closely, his expression growing more serious with every word. "You're certain about the symbols?" he asked when she finished. "As certain as memory allows," Miren replied, describing what she had seen as accurately as she could. Rogan was silent for a long moment, considering her words. His gaze drifted into the distance with the same intense concentration he brought to every professional problem. "This could be important," he finally said. "Very important, Myra." Then he looked directly at her. "How does an ordinary maid know enough to recognize a diplomatic cipher?" Miren felt everything inside her tighten at the sharp, perceptive question. She had clearly underestimated just how observant he was. "My uncle," she said carefully, keeping her answer as close to the truth as possible. "He taught me many things when I was a child. He was an educated man. He had an interest in history and languages." Rogan studied her for a long moment, as though weighing the truth of her explanation. Under that steady, searching gaze, Miren found it difficult to breathe. Not because she feared being exposed, because of something more unsettling, something more personal, something that seemed to grow between them with every moment they spent standing this close. "An unusual education for a maid," he said at last. There was no obvious suspicion in his voice, only growing curiosity. "But I suppose I should be grateful for it, considering how valuable this information may prove." The investigation sparked by her discovery required them to spend far more time together than either of them could have imagined when they first collided in the palace corridor. Once Rogan became convinced of Miren's intelligence and reliability, he began drawing her into the unofficial side of his investigation, not as a formal ally, that would have been unthinkable for a servant, but as a trusted observer whose place among the palace staff gave her access to rooms and conversations the royal guard could never reach openly. They met in the evenings, in quiet corners of the palace, sometimes in the same garden pavilion where they had first truly spoken. Other times in the small library of the Eastern Wing, which few courtiers ever visited. "Another coded note," Miren said one evening, handing Rogan a scrap of parchment that one of the suspected advisors had accidentally dropped. "I found it in the corridor outside Lord Cassian's chambers." Rogan reached for the paper. Their fingers touched. It lasted only a second, a fleeting, accidental brush of skin, yet both of them felt the strange electric jolt of that simple contact. For one suspended moment, neither moved. Then they quickly looked away. "Thank you," Rogan said quietly. His voice sounded slightly rougher than usual. "You're welcome," Miren replied, painfully aware that her heart was beating far too fast for such an ordinary exchange. They bent over the table together, studying the document by the dim light of the single candle illuminating their secret meeting. Their heads were far too close. "It looks like a list of names," Rogan said, his eyes moving over the coded lines. "Possibly conspirators, or their supporters." Miren leaned closer to study the parchment. Their shoulders touched. Another wave of that same unsettling, inexplicable warmth passed through her. "Sorry," she whispered, quickly pulling back, even though part of her had no desire to retreat at all. "There's no need," Rogan replied. His gaze lingered on her face for a heartbeat, carrying an expression she could not entirely read. Then he turned abruptly back to the document, as though taking refuge in professional concentration from the increasingly undeniable attraction building between them. A few days later, an incident made that unspoken tension even harder to ignore. Miren was carrying a dinner tray through one of the palace corridors when her foot slipped on a section of floor that had been freshly washed. The tray crashed to the ground with the dull clatter of breaking dishes. "Are you all right?" Rogan happened to be nearby and rushed toward her, helping her up before she had fully processed the fall. "I'm fine," she assured him. But the moment she tried to put weight on one foot, a sharp pain shot through her ankle. Rogan noticed the brief grimace she tried to hide. He did not give her the chance to argue. Instead, he lifted her into his arms with the same easy confidence he had shown when catching her falling tray on the day they first met. "What are you doing?" Miren exclaimed, her cheeks instantly burning at the sudden intimate closeness. "Taking you to the infirmary," Rogan answered calmly, yet pressed this close to his chest, she could clearly feel the rapid beat of his heart, betraying the fact that he was not nearly as calm as he sounded. "You are not going to limp through the palace on an injured ankle." Miren could think of no convincing argument, partly because, to her embarrassment, some part of her was enjoying this unexpected closeness, far more than a simple maid being carried in the arms of the captain of the guard had any right to. He carried her through the palace corridors with the same steady seriousness that marked everything he did. Miren stole occasional glances at his focused profile, now only inches from her face, and with every step, it became harder to deny the attraction between them. No matter how inappropriate such feelings were for someone of her true and carefully hidden position. At the infirmary, while the elderly physician examined her ankle, Rogan remained near the door. He seemed in no hurry to leave, despite there being no real reason for him to stay. "Are you planning to wait for the physician's verdict, Captain?" Miren asked, a teasing smile touching her lips as she noticed his hesitation. "I suppose I am," Rogan replied, a hint of an embarrassed smile softening his usually serious expression. "You never know. I might have to carry you back to the servants' quarters." "It's only a mild sprain," the physician interrupted as he finished the examination. "A couple of days of rest, and you'll be fine." "A pity," Rogan murmured, too quietly for the physician to hear, but perfectly clearly from Miren. "Now I have no excuse to carry you again." Miren felt her heart stop for a beat. When their eyes met, she saw the same confusion in his gray gaze that she felt inside herself, the same struggle between restraint and something growing stronger with every passing day, something neither of them could honestly deny anymore. "This is becoming dangerous," she thought, looking away first because she could no longer bear the intensity of that silent confession. "Dangerous for both of us, no matter how much I want to be near him." Chapter 3. The sprain really was minor, and by the next day, Miren had returned to her usual duties, though a slight limp still reminded her of it whenever she walked for too long. But something else had changed after the incident in the corridor. Something far more significant. The line between restrained professional distance and the growing personal attraction between her and Rogan had become so blurred that both of them seemed to be balancing on its edge, neither willing to cross it completely, yet neither able to step away. "You're here again," Miren remarked one evening when she found Rogan in what had become their familiar garden pavilion, the place she now visited almost every night, secretly hoping, though she barely admitted it even to herself, that he would be there. "Habit," he replied, with the hint of a smile, shifting along the bench to make room for her beside him. "Or perhaps something more than habit, if I'm being completely honest." Miren sat down next to him, already familiar with the warmth of his presence so close to her. In the cool evening air, their shoulders almost touched. "Any news about the investigation?" she asked, though they both understood that the professional question was more an excuse to keep talking than a genuine necessity. "A little," Rogan admitted. "The list of names we found leads to several minor nobles, but the true organizer of the conspiracy is still unclear. Lord Cassian appears to be only an intermediary, not the mastermind." Miren nodded, thinking over his words, but her thoughts kept drifting back to questions far more personal and far more troubling than the details of the investigation. "Rogan," she said suddenly, using his name without the formal title of captain for the first time. "May I ask you something personal?" He looked at her with obvious surprise at the sudden change of subject, but nodded. "Go ahead." "Why have you never married?" she asked carefully. "From what I've heard in the palace gossip, you've been captain of the guard for quite some time. You have a respectable position. I imagine plenty of court ladies would consider you a very desirable match." Rogan was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the first stars appearing in the evening sky. "I never found the right reason," he finally said. "The court ladies you're talking about tend to be more interested in my rank and connections than in me. It's difficult to build anything genuine on that kind of foundation." "And what would be the right reason?" Miren asked softly, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. Rogan turned toward her. His expression was serious, filled with something deeper than simple curiosity. "Sincerity," he said quietly. "Someone who sees me not as the captain of the royal guard, not as a man with a certain position, but simply as myself. That is a rare thing at a court built on ambition and calculation." The words hung between them in the evening air, carrying an unspoken but unmistakable meaning. Miren felt her heart begin to beat faster as she realized where the conversation was leading. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "that kind of sincerity can be found somewhere other than among court ladies." "Perhaps," Rogan agreed softly. His gaze remained fixed on her face, with the same intensity that sent a shiver of anticipation over her skin. They sat that way for a long time, separated by only a few inches, yet bound by an invisible thread of attraction that grew stronger with every passing moment. And still, despite the increasingly obvious truth between them, both stubbornly refused to say it aloud. Days turned into weeks. The investigation moved slowly but steadily forward, each new clue bringing them closer to discovering who truly stood behind the threat to the king. But alongside that official investigation, another story was unfolding, one far more personal and far more dangerous to them both. The growing closeness between the captain of the guard and the mysterious maid whose true identity remained completely unknown to Rogan, and increasingly fascinating. The tension between them sharpened even further about 2 weeks after they first met. Miren had stayed up late, helping Rogan sort through another batch of intercepted documents, when a wave of exhaustion suddenly overcame her. "Just for a moment," she told herself. She lowered her head onto her folded arms on the table. She never noticed when she fell asleep, lulled by the soft rustle of papers and by the presence of the man whose company now brought her more peace than she was willing to admit, even to herself. When Rogan realized she had fallen asleep at the table, he stood for a long moment, simply watching her. In sleep, her face looked peaceful, unguarded, vulnerable, and the tenderness he had begun to feel for this strange, extraordinary maid swept over him with a force he could no longer fully deny. Careful not to wake her with any sudden movement, he removed his cloak and draped it over her shoulders to protect her from the evening chill of the library. Then he allowed his gaze to linger on her sleeping face, a little longer than professional good sense should have permitted. "Who are you really, Myra?" The thought came unbidden as he studied the delicate, almost aristocratic lines of her face. Too refined for an ordinary maid. Even in sleep, her posture held a kind of unconscious grace that did not belong to someone raised in servants' quarters. Miren stirred a few minutes later, waking as the cloak shifted against her shoulders. She opened her eyes and found Rogan sitting opposite her, watching her with the same warm, searching gaze that made her heart race every time they met. "I'm sorry," she whispered, quickly sitting upright as embarrassment warmed her cheeks. I didn't even realize I'd fallen asleep. Don't apologize, Rogan said quietly. You looked too peaceful to wake before I had to. Warmth spread through Miren's chest at the simple sincerity of his concern. Acting on an impulse she could no longer resist, she reached up to return the cloak still draped over her shoulders. Their hands touched as she passed it back. This time, neither of them pulled away. It was as though they had both finally grown tired of pretending there was nothing between them. Rogan, Miren whispered, her eyes fixed on his face in the soft light of the single candle. What is happening between us? He was silent for a long moment. She could see the same struggle in him that had been tearing at her own heart, the conflict between duty, common sense, and something growing too powerful to ignore. I don't know, he admitted at last, his voice rough with emotion he was struggling to contain. I only know that I can't keep pretending I feel nothing for you, Myra, no matter how inappropriate it may be. The honesty in his words stripped away the last of Miren's defenses. All of Aldis's warnings about caution and distance suddenly seemed far less powerful than the man sitting across from her. But before either of them could say or do anything that might finally define what was growing between them, footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. They sprang apart almost at once, returning to a carefully professional distance just before one of the younger guards entered the library with an urgent report for the captain. The moment was gone, but the tension left behind by that interrupted confession only grew stronger, and both of them were left with the same question neither was yet brave enough to ask aloud. What would happen when they finally stopped fighting the attraction that bound them more tightly with every day they spent together? Chapter 4. 3 days after that interrupted moment in the library, the conspiracy suddenly took on a far more concrete and far more alarming shape. We found something important, Rogan said when he sought Miren out in the garden that evening, an unusual urgency in his voice. One of the guards intercepted a message that gives us a specific date. The conspirators intend to act in 1 week, during the reception marking the anniversary of the king's accession to the throne. Miren felt her heart tighten with fear for her brother. By now, she saw Edric from a distance almost every day, yet she still had not dared speak to him directly, following Aldis's strict instructions to keep her identity secret unless there was absolutely no other choice. What are they planning? She asked. We don't know for certain yet, Rogan admitted. It could be an assassination attempt during the reception, or something more elaborate. We need more information before we can act with confidence. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression carrying both professional concern and something far more personal. I'm going to need your help more than usual over the next few days, he said. I'm sorry for involving you in something that could be dangerous for an ordinary maid. Don't apologize, Miren replied firmly. I'll help however I can, no matter the risk. Rogan nodded, but his gaze remained on her face, filled with a worry he no longer seemed interested in hiding. Just be careful, he said quietly. Promise me that, Myra. I promise. Despite the growing fear for her brother and the kingdom, warmth spread through her chest at the unmistakable concern in his voice. The following days passed in a blur of tense, feverish activity. Miren and Rogan now met almost every day, comparing fragments of information gathered from different sources and trying to piece together the full shape of the approaching threat before the conspirators could put their plan into motion. One evening, they were sorting through another collection of documents in a hidden room Rogan had set aside for their meetings, far from curious eyes. Miren was so absorbed in deciphering a particularly complicated letter that she failed to notice the oil lamp on the table beginning to tilt dangerously after her elbow brushed against it. The lamp fell, glass shattered. Burning oil spread across the edge of the wooden table, flames immediately catching among the scattered documents. Fire! Miren cried, stumbling backward in alarm. Rogan reacted instantly. He seized a heavy cloak from the back of a nearby chair and threw it over the flames, smothering them with several hard, decisive blows before the fire could spread any farther. "Are you hurt?" he asked, turning toward Miren the moment the flames were out. The concern on his face was unmistakable. "No," she said, though her hands were trembling from the shock. "I'm sorry. I wasn't paying attention." "The only thing that matters is that you're safe." He moved toward her with the same protective urgency he had shown when she injured her ankle. Taking her shaking hands in his, Rogan carefully examined them for burns. Miren felt the warmth of his palms around hers, and gradually the fear of what had just happened gave way to something much warmer and far more unsettling. A closeness she had never asked for, and yet wanted desperately. "You're sure you weren't burned?" he asked softly, his gaze fixed on her face with the same intensity that made her heartbeat quicken whenever they stood this close. "I'm sure," she whispered, though a stubborn part of her mind insisted that the real danger she should be afraid of had nothing to do with spilled oil or open flame. It was the relentless attraction she felt toward the man whose hands still held hers with a tenderness she had never known from anyone else. Rogan seemed to realize the intimacy of the moment as well. His gaze dropped from her eyes to her lips, and then returned, as though he were fighting an impulse he could no longer fully control. "Myra," he whispered, his voice rough with restrained emotion. "I need to tell you something." "What?" she whispered back, barely breathing. "I think about you far more often than any professional partnership could possibly justify," he said quietly. "Your company has become something I look forward to every day, no matter how inappropriate that may seem for a man in my position toward—" He hesitated, clearly struggling to finish the sentence. "Toward an ordinary maid?" Miren completed for him, with a faint, trembling smile. The irony of those words twisted painfully inside her. If only he knew how far she truly was from being ordinary. "Yes," Rogan admitted, "but the more I get to know you, the less that distinction seems to matter." Miren stared at him for a long, charged moment. The last pieces of her resistance were beginning to crumble beneath the force of his honesty. But then she remembered Aldous' warnings, the need for secrecy, the danger of revealing herself before the right moment. And somehow, she found the strength to take a step back, breaking the intimacy before it slipped entirely beyond their control. "We need to finish going through the documents," she said quietly. Her voice trembled with the regret she could barely suppress. "The conspirators aren't going to wait for us to figure out—" She stopped, unable to find a word for what was happening between them. "This," Rogan finished softly. His expression showed the same understanding and the same regret that filled her own heart. "You're right. The investigation comes first, no matter how strong our personal feelings may be." They returned to the documents in a tense silence filled with everything they had not said. Both of them knew the moment they had been avoiding and secretly longing for had only been postponed, not prevented. And sooner or later, when they faced another moment like this, neither of them would have the strength to step away again from the attraction binding them more tightly with every hour they spent together. Chapter 5. The reception celebrating the anniversary of the king's ascension to the throne began with all the grandeur expected of such an occasion. The palace's great hall filled with nobles dressed in their finest clothes, musicians played ceremonial melodies, and Edric sat upon the raised dais, accepting congratulations from an endless procession of courtiers. Miren, dressed in a servant's uniform, moved among the guests, carrying trays of wine and doing her best to remain unnoticed, just as Rogan had instructed. But every nerve in her body was stretched tight as she waited for the danger hinted at in the conspirators' intercepted messages. Rogan, wearing the formal uniform of the captain of the Royal Guard, moved through the hall with deceptive ease, carefully watching every suspicious gesture among the gathered crowd. Hour after hour passed without any visible sign of danger. Miren had almost begun to hope the intercepted information had been a false alarm, when she noticed something that turned her blood cold. One of the younger guards, stationed beside a side entrance, gave a barely perceptible nod to a figure in a dark cloak who slipped into the shadow of a column near the king's dais. The movement was far too coordinated to be coincidence. Without stopping to think, Miren hurried through the crowd toward the place where she had last seen Rogan, her heart pounding with rising dread. "Rogan," she whispered when she finally found him near the opposite wall. By the side entrance, a man in a dark cloak. One of the younger guards signaled to him. Something is wrong. Rogan became instantly alert. His gaze shot in the direction she indicated, and whatever he saw there transformed his expression into a mask of cold, professional resolve. "Stay here," he ordered firmly. "Do not come any closer, no matter what happens." But before he could move toward the threat, the cloaked figure suddenly lunged forward toward the king's dais, one hand reaching beneath his cloak for a concealed weapon. "Assassin!" Rogan shouted, charging forward with the speed born of years of military training. The hall erupted into chaos. Guests scattered in panic. Guards rushed toward the attacker from every direction. But Miren forgot every warning she had ever been given about caution. She saw only one thing: her brother. A man she had never truly known, yet whose life she had sworn to protect. And he was only seconds away from death. Miren pushed through the fleeing crowd before reason could catch up with instinct. Rogan reached the attacker first. The fight was brief, but vicious. With one practiced movement, Rogan disarmed the conspirator, but not before the man managed to hurl a short dagger toward the king's dais. The blade missed Edric by inches, but its path changed when Miren, who happened to be closest to the dais at that critical moment, instinctively rushed forward to shove a terrified courtier out of the way. The dagger veered from its original course. Its edge sliced across her forearm. Pain exploded through her in a burning flash. Miren staggered as blood began to seep through the torn sleeve of her dress, but she remained on her feet, too shocked by what had happened to fully understand the wound. "Miren!" Rogan had subdued the attacker and spun toward the sound of her strangled cry. The sight of blood on her arm and the pain and shock on her pale face shattered every trace of his professional restraint. He rushed toward her with a panic she had only ever seen him display in moments of true crisis. He did not even realize he had called her by her real name for the first time since they met. His fear for her had overwhelmed everything else. "You're hurt," he said as he reached her. His hands trembled as he carefully examined the bleeding cut along her forearm. "Gods, Myra, why did you rush in? I told you to stay back." "I couldn't," she whispered. The pain and shock were beginning to catch up with her, and her knees felt weak beneath her. "I couldn't let him get hurt." "Him?" Rogan repeated, clearly confused about whom she meant. But there was no time for questions. Before she could collapse completely, Rogan swept her into his arms and carried her out of the chaotic hall into the nearest quiet room. Behind them, the Royal Guard was already regaining control of the situation. The attacker and several suspected accomplices had been arrested. In the private room, Rogan gently lowered Miren onto a small couch. He tore a strip from a clean piece of cloth and began bandaging her wound with the same precise concentration he brought to everything he did. "It isn't deep," he said after cleaning the cut. "You were lucky. The blade didn't hit anything important." "I know," Miren whispered, still trembling from what had happened. "But I had to do it. I couldn't let him." She stopped herself again. She had come dangerously close to revealing the secret she had sworn to protect. Rogan studied her for a long moment. Professional curiosity was there in his expression, but it was overwhelmed by something much stronger: fear for her. You're always leaving something unsaid, Myra, he said quietly. You have been since the day we met. His eyes searched hers. Who are you, really? Miren remained silent for a long time. She was torn between the promise she had made to Aldous and the unbearable weight of continuing to lie to a man whose feelings for her now seemed every bit as sincere and deep as her own. I can't tell you yet, she finally whispered. Tears burned behind her eyes. I'm sorry, Rogan. There are reasons I have to remain silent, but I swear to you, I mean no harm to you, to the king, or to anyone else in this palace. Rogan watched her closely. Whatever he saw in her eyes, the sincerity, the pain of being forced to lie, the complete absence of malice, seemed to convince him more than any explanation could have. All right, he said softly. I won't push you. Not now. He hesitated. But promise me that one day you'll tell me the truth. I can't keep... He stopped, struggling to find words for the thing between them they had both avoided naming. I can't keep feeling what I feel for you while knowing you're hiding so much from me. I promise, Miren whispered. The words felt heavy in her chest, like an oath. When the time comes, I'll tell you everything. Rogan nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on her pale face, still filled with a tenderness he was no longer trying to hide. You terrified me today, he said quietly. His hand rose and gently touched her cheek, brushing away a single tear. When I saw the blood on your arm. His voice broke before he could finish. I'm sorry, Miren whispered, covering his hand with hers. I didn't mean to frighten you. Don't apologize, Rogan said hoarsely. He drew a breath. Let me stop pretending, at least for this moment. Let me stop pretending I don't feel what I actually feel for you. Before Miren could answer, he leaned forward and kissed her. The kiss was fierce and desperate, carrying all the fear of the past few minutes and all the emotion he had spent so long hiding beneath the disciplined mask of a soldier. Miren kissed him back with equal intensity. All the attraction they had denied, restrained, and tried to ignore finally broke free. Caution could not stop it. Promises could not stop it. Not even the difference in their true positions, a difference Rogan still knew nothing about, could stop it. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Their foreheads rested together in the quiet intimacy that followed the fear, the chaos, and the confession they had both wanted for far too long. Rogan, Miren whispered, whatever happens next, whatever I may be forced to reveal to you one day, you need to know something. She looked into his eyes. What I feel for you now is real, completely real. No matter what secrets I still have to keep. I believe you, he whispered. He pulled her closer, holding her with the same tenderness that had filled their desperate first kiss. I believe you, despite everything you haven't told me, Myra. Then his voice softened. Just promise me you'll be more careful from now on. I don't think I could bear it if one day I wasn't fast enough to protect you. Miren nodded and leaned closer against him. She could feel the love growing between them, becoming stronger after everything they had survived together. But deep inside, one troubling thought refused to leave her. The true test of what they had begun was still ahead, because the secret she carried was far greater than anything Rogan could possibly imagine. Chapter 6. News of the failed assassination attempt spread through the palace like wildfire, but the identity of the true mastermind behind the conspiracy remained unclear. The captured attacker, a man named Gareth, had turned out to be little more than a hired weapon. Even under threat of severe punishment, he refused to reveal who had given the orders. Miren, her forearms still wrapped in a bandage, met Aldous 2 days after the attack in a secluded corner of the palace gardens. He had summoned her there with a secret note filled with urgent warnings. You took an unnecessary risk, he said sharply the moment she approached. His usually calm expression was filled with undisguised concern. Throwing yourself forward into the path of a blade was reckless. Reckless in a way that does not become a future queen, should matters ever come to that. I couldn't let Edric be hurt, Miren replied firmly. He is my brother, Uncle, whether he knows I exist or not. Aldous sighed, his expression softening at the sight of her unwavering determination. I understand how you feel, child, he said more quietly, but you must remember your role. You are meant to remain hidden, a final safeguard if all else fails, not to risk your life before it becomes necessary. If the conspirators discover your existence before we are ready to act openly, everything we have done to protect you will have been for nothing. I know, Miren whispered, feeling the weight of that reminder settle heavily over her. But there is something else I need to tell you. She told him about Captain Rogan, about the growing closeness between them, about the kiss after the assassination attempt, and about his persistent, though still restrained, questions concerning who she truly was. Aldis's face darkened as she spoke, the worry in his eyes becoming even more pronounced. This is dangerous, Miren, he said firmly. Not only for you, but for everything we have planned. If Captain Rogan learns the truth too soon, even with the best intentions, he could unknowingly put you at risk. He might confide in one of his men, or simply begin treating you differently enough that someone notices. I can't simply stop feeling what I feel for him, Uncle, Miren said softly, though with the same unshakable resolve that had always been part of her nature. Aldous was silent for a long moment, studying her face with an expression that mixed sympathy with the old, familiar anxiety of a man who had spent too many years responsible for someone else's safety. Then be extremely careful, he finally said. Keep your distance as much as you can until the conspiracy has been completely exposed and destroyed. Then his voice softened. After that, you will be free to follow your own heart, whether I approve of your choice or not. Miren nodded. Inside, however, conflicting emotions were raging. There was relief in receiving what amounted to a conditional blessing from the man who had raised her. But there was also a much deeper fear. She had no idea whether she could truly keep her distance from Rogan, now that they had already shared that desperate, honest kiss. Over the following days, Miren tried to avoid him as much as the investigation allowed. Their long evening conversations became brief, practical exchanges. Warmth was replaced by carefully chosen professional words. But the artificial distance was painful to maintain, and from the way Rogan's eyes increasingly followed her, with confusion and a hurt he clearly tried to conceal, she knew he had noticed the change, even if he had no idea what had caused it. You're avoiding me, he said bluntly one evening when he caught up with her in a corridor of the Eastern Wing. Miren had been hurrying away after yet another attempt to escape an accidental meeting. Something changed after that kiss. Did I say something wrong? No, Miren answered quickly. A sharp stab of guilt went through her when she saw the pain in his gray eyes. It isn't you, Rogan. It's just, there are circumstances that force me to be more careful. Circumstances connected to the secret you still refuse to tell me? He concluded. His voice was tense, but not angry. If anything, he sounded tired of the uncertainty that continued to hang between them. Yes, she admitted quietly. Rogan watched her for a long moment before stepping closer, narrowing the distance she had worked so hard to keep between them. Myra, he said softly, whatever you're hiding, I promise you, it won't change how I feel about you. He paused, searching for the right words. But this uncertainty, his voice trailed off. It's hard on both of us, isn't it? It is, Miren admitted. Unexpected tears burned behind her eyes. Please, just give me a little more time. I promise everything will become clear soon. Rogan nodded. The disappointment of yet another delay was obvious in his expression, but he did not press her. Instead, he gently touched her hand, a quiet gesture of understanding and support, before allowing her to continue on her way. The invisible thread between them remained, stretched, strained, but unbroken. Neither of them had found the strength to sever it. The breakthrough in the investigation came a week later. One of Rogan's trusted men among the palace guard, secretly placed within the circle of suspected conspirators, finally obtained direct proof of the identity of the man behind the entire plot. Lord Valdis, Rogan told Miren that evening when he found her in their now familiar garden pavilion. There was unmistakable relief in his voice. A distant relative of the late king. He has his own claim to the throne through an older line of succession, weak but not entirely without legitimacy. Miren listened in silence. He organized everything, Rogan continued. He intends to remove Edric and seize power under the pretense of restoring the true royal bloodline. A chill ran through Miren. If Valdis truly intended to claim the throne through his own distant inheritance, then the existence of Edric's twin sister represented a direct threat to everything he was trying to achieve. Her claim was far stronger, far more legitimate, and that meant that if Valdis ever learned she existed, she would become another obstacle he needed to remove. "Does he know about me?" she asked quietly. The fear tightened around her chest the moment she said the words. Rogan looked at her sharply. "I don't think so," he replied, though there was caution in his voice. "But, Myra," he stepped closer, "if you know something that puts your own life at risk, please tell me. I can't protect you properly while I'm still acting blind." Miren remained silent for a long time. The weight of the secret she carried was becoming almost unbearable, now that the danger had become so real. Yet Aldis's warning still held her back from telling Rogan everything. "Not yet," she whispered at last. Rogan's expression tightened. "But I promise you, Rogan, when the time comes to move openly against Valdis, I will tell you everything." She held his gaze. The whole truth, nothing hidden. Rogan nodded, but if anything, her answer seemed only to deepen his concern. And as Miren watched his troubled face beneath the soft glow of the evening stars, she knew the moment was drawing near when the secret she had guarded all her life would have to come into the light, whether she was ready for it or not. Chapter 7. The endgame came sooner than any of them expected. 3 days after their conversation in the garden, Miren was carrying out her usual duties in the eastern wing when she accidentally overheard part of a conversation through the half-open door of a guest chamber reserved for important visitors. The words made her freeze in horror. "Tonight," said an unfamiliar voice with the cold certainty of a seasoned conspirator. "While the guard is distracted by the false alarm we'll create at the eastern gate, the main group will enter the throne room through the hidden passage. By dawn, the king will be dead, and the throne will be open for its rightful heir." Miren felt her blood run cold. Valdis had decided to act immediately. Perhaps he had realized Rogan's investigation was getting too close. She rushed to find Rogan, gripped by the same panic she had felt during the assassination attempt at the reception. But the captain of the guard was nowhere to be found in any of their usual meeting places. Desperate and running out of time, Miren made a decision she knew would change everything between her and the man she had come to love. She went straight to the throne room. According to the servants, the king was there that evening. She would warn him herself. The throne room was nearly empty. Only a handful of guards stood at the entrance, while Edric sat at a small table near the throne, absorbed in state papers. "Your Majesty," Miren said as she approached, every step driven by the same determination that had seized her the moment she overheard the plot. "Forgive my boldness, but I have urgent information concerning your safety." Edric looked up at her in surprise. He was clearly unaccustomed to being addressed so directly by an ordinary maid, but something in her voice convinced him to take her seriously. "Speak," he ordered. "The plot against you is happening tonight," Miren said quickly, recounting the conversation as accurately as she could. "Lord Valdis is behind it. He plans to create a diversion at the eastern gate, then enter the throne room through a hidden passage while the guard is distracted." Edric went pale and rose from the table, but the look he gave her held something deeper than simple surprise, confusion, recognition. "Why would a servant know such details?" he asked sharply, though his voice sounded more bewildered than accusing. Then he stopped. His eyes searched her face. "Why?" The word faded as he stared at her, as though something in her features seemed strangely familiar, though he could not yet understand why. Miren felt the moment she had avoided for so long finally catch up with her. There was nowhere left to hide. "Because I am your sister, Your Majesty," she said quietly. The words were difficult to say after so many weeks of secrecy. "Your twin sister. We were separated at birth by order of a secret council because they feared a prophecy that said one twin would betray the crown and the other would save it." The silence that followed was absolute, deafening. Edric stared at her for a long, tense moment, trying to reconcile the impossible nature of what she had just said with the growing recognition of his own features in hers. "That's impossible," he whispered at last, but there was little disbelief in his voice, only shock. "It is possible," Miren said firmly. "I was raised in secret under the protection of Advisor Aldous. They kept me hidden in case the day ever came when you faced a real threat of being overthrown." She held his gaze. "That day is today, Your Majesty. We need to act now." Before Edric could answer, an alarm bell rang somewhere on the eastern side of the palace. The conspirators' diversion had begun exactly as Miren had overheard. Rogan arrived only minutes later, bursting into the throne room with his sword drawn and clear panic on his face. "Your Majesty, Lady Myra," he began urgently. "The eastern gate is under attack, but I fear it may only be a diversion." He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes moved between Miren and the king, then back again. The extraordinary resemblance between them suddenly became impossible to ignore. "What is going on?" he asked slowly. Judging by the shock spreading across his face, part of the answer was already becoming clear to him. "I'll explain everything later," Miren said quickly. "But right now, we need to protect the king. The conspirators are coming through a hidden passage while the guard is distracted at the eastern gate." Despite his obvious shock and the countless unanswered questions, Rogan reacted with the same professional speed he always showed in a crisis. He immediately organized the handful of guards still stationed near the throne room and positioned them around the hidden passage Miren had described. The wait was tense, but brief. Only minutes later, a group of armed men in dark cloaks emerged from the passage. Lord Valdis himself led them. They had clearly expected to catch the king completely unprepared. "Guard!" Rogan shouted. The soldiers hiding in position attacked before the conspirators fully understood that their plan had been exposed. The fight was short, but brutal. Rogan's men had the advantage of surprise and preparation, and the balance quickly turned in favor of the crown. When Valdis realized the attack had failed, he tried to flee back through the hidden passage. He never made it. The guards seized him before he could disappear. "Take him into custody," Rogan ordered, "and every one of his accomplices." His voice was hard and final. "The conspiracy against the crown is over." When the fighting ended and Valdis and his men were securely chained under heavy guard, Edric turned back to Miren. His expression held shock, curiosity, and something else now. Something hesitant. Something almost familiar. "Tell me everything," he said quietly. All of it. From the beginning. For the first time in her life, Miren felt the weight of the secret begin to lift from her shoulders. She told him the entire story, the prophecy, the decision of the secret council, the years she had spent under Aldous' protection, believing him to be her uncle, the truth he revealed after the death of their parents, and finally, her arrival at the palace disguised as a servant, prepared to reveal herself only if protecting Edric made it necessary. Edric listened without interrupting. Slowly, his expression softened. The shock gave way to something warmer, more human. "I have a sister," he whispered at last, as though testing the thought for the first time. "All those years alone." He looked at her. "All those years on the throne. And I had a twin sister whose existence I never even knew about." "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner," Miren said softly. "The secrecy was meant to protect both of us." "I understand," Edric replied. For the first time during the conversation, a warm, genuine smile touched his lips. "And I'm grateful for what you did tonight." His voice softened. "You saved my life, sister." The words struck Miren with a deep, almost overwhelming warmth. Sister. Spoken aloud between them for the first time. It felt like confirmation of a bond she had carried inside her without even knowing it existed for most of her life. Rogan had remained nearby throughout the conversation. Now he was looking at her with an entirely new expression. Shock had slowly given way to understanding, and then to something more complicated, more personal. Miren felt a sharp stab of fear for what this revelation might mean for the relationship that had only just begun to bloom between them. "Miren," Rogan said quietly, using her real name for the first time. Then he added the word that changed everything. "Princess." The title carried an unmistakable distance, not coldness, but the sudden awareness of a difference in rank that neither of them had been forced to face before. And hearing it sent a chill through Miren's heart. The gulf she had feared for so long was no longer hidden. Now it stood openly between them. And for the first time, she wondered whether the truth that had saved her brother's life might destroy the fragile, sincere love she and Rogan had built together. Chapter 8. The silence that fell between Miren and Rogan after his quiet, newly distant use of the word princess felt more unbearable than any shout or accusation could have. Edric noticed the tension and tactfully stepped away, issuing orders concerning the captured conspirators and arranging additional security for the rest of the night. He left his sister and the captain of the guard alone, with a crisis far more personal than anything happening elsewhere in the palace. "Rogan," Miren began, taking a step toward him. "Please, let me explain." "Princess," he repeated. This time there was unmistakable bitterness in his voice. He stepped back, as though physical distance might somehow protect him from the pain of what he had just learned. "All this time, every conversation, every moment between us, you knew who you really were, while I knew nothing." "I did," Miren admitted. Tears burned behind her eyes at the obvious hurt in his voice. "But I couldn't tell you the truth, Rogan. Too much was at stake. Not only my safety, but Edric's, and the entire plan to protect the throne." "I understand why," he said quietly. But understanding was not the same as forgiveness. "It doesn't make this easier, Miren. I fell in love with a simple maid named Myra. And now I discover that all along I was falling in love with a princess who was hiding her true identity from me." "I never stopped being myself," she replied firmly, moving closer despite his instinctive retreat. "Myra or Miren, whatever name I used, what I felt for you was real. My title never changed that." Rogan was silent for a long moment. His expression shifted between anger at the deception and the undeniable pull he still felt toward her. Even after a revelation this enormous, he could not simply erase what had grown between them. "What happens now?" he finally asked, exhaustion in his voice. "You're a princess, the king's sister. I'm only the captain of his guard." That kind of difference in rank doesn't exactly make it easy to continue whatever this was becoming. Miren's heart tightened. She had feared losing him from the moment she first realized the truth would eventually have to come out. And now that moment had arrived. "I don't want the throne, Rogan," she said firmly. "I never wanted that life. I was raised as a safeguard, someone who could step forward if disaster ever struck. But the conspiracy has been exposed. Edric is safe. I have no desire to remain at court and spend the rest of my life trapped in political games and intrigue." "Then what do you want?" he asked softly. There was caution in his expression, but there was hope, too. "A simple life," Miren answered honestly. "The kind of life I had before Uncle Aldous told me the truth. A life where someone loves me for who I am, not because of a title or my place at court." Rogan watched her for a long, tense moment. Then, slowly, uncertainly, he stepped closer again, closing some of the distance he had created between them. "And me?" he asked quietly. "Would there be room in that simple life for an ordinary captain of the guard?" "Only if that captain wants to be there," Miren whispered. Hope flared in her chest as she saw his expression soften. The following days passed in a whirlwind of official duties and formalities. The captured conspirators were questioned. The existence of the king's long-lost sister was publicly announced. Miren was presented before the royal council, whose members were stunned by the unexpected fulfillment of the old prophecy. To her immense relief, Edric welcomed his newly discovered sister with genuine warmth. They spent long hours getting to know one another, trying to fill years of separation with conversations about childhoods that had unfolded along completely different paths. They spoke of the parents Miren had never truly known, of the life Edric had lived inside the palace walls, and of the future that now lay before them both after their long-delayed reunion. "Are you certain you don't want to remain at court?" Edric asked one afternoon, as they sat together in the small garden that had become Miren's favorite place to think. "As a princess, you could hold an important position. You could influence the kingdom. Help me rule." "I'm grateful for the offer," Miren replied warmly. "But my heart wants a different life, brother. Something simpler, free from the endless intrigue and political calculation that seems to shape the life of everyone in this palace." Edric studied her for a long moment, before nodding with understanding. There was no offense in his expression. "Then you have my blessing," he said quietly. "You already saved my life once, sister. The least I can do is allow you to follow your own heart, wherever it leads you." "Thank you," Miren whispered. She embraced him with the same genuine affection that had grown stronger between them with each passing day. "I promise I'll visit often, no matter where my new life takes me." Rogan found her in the garden that same evening. So many important moments in her new life had taken place there, but this time, he approached without hesitation, without bitterness. His expression held a determination she had never seen before. "Miren," he said. For the first time, he spoke her real name without distance or pain, only tenderness. "I've spent the last few days thinking." "And what did you decide?" she asked, barely breathing. "That I can't imagine my future without you," he said firmly. "Whether you are a princess or a servant makes no difference to me." He stepped closer. "I fell in love with your courage, your sharp mind, your honesty. None of those things changed when I learned about your title." Tears of relief and overwhelming happiness filled Miren's eyes. "I have an estate," Rogan continued. "It belonged to my father. It's far from the capital and far from palace politics. It isn't grand, but it's comfortable, quiet." His expression softened. "We could build a life there together, a simple one, an honest one." He paused. "If that is the future you want." "Yes," Miren whispered without a moment's hesitation. 1,000 times yes, Rogan. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her with the same passion that had filled their first desperate kiss after the assassination attempt. But this time there was no fear, no uncertainty, no secret hanging between them. Only the certainty of a future they had freely chosen together. They were married 1 month later. The ceremony was small, attended only by those closest to them. Edric gave his heartfelt blessing to his sister's marriage to the man who had protected her more than once during their brief but extraordinary time together. Aldous was there too, finally setting aside the role of the pretend uncle and allowing Miren to see the full depth of the fatherly love he had developed for her during all those years of secret guardianship. After the ceremony, Miren and Rogan left the capital and traveled to his family estate. It was a peaceful place among green hills, far from court intrigue, secret conspiracies, and the endless political calculations that defined life in the royal palace. "Do you regret it?" Rogan asked one evening, as they sat together on the porch of their new home, watching the sunset turn the sky warm shades of gold. "Not for a second," Miren replied with a peaceful, genuine smile, resting her head against his shoulder. She did so now with a natural closeness that no longer needed to be hidden. "I found something here far more valuable than a crown or a throne." She looked up at him. "A real home, and a love that doesn't depend on titles, lies, or secrets." Rogan pulled her closer and kissed the top of her head with the same tenderness that had marked every touch since the day they finally stopped hiding what they felt. "So did I," he whispered. "I found more than I ever thought I would." He smiled. "Miren, I love you, princess or not, with titles or without them." The last light of sunset disappeared beyond the horizon, covering the quiet hills in the deep velvet colors of evening. And there, on the porch of their new home, stood a princess who had turned away from the throne in favor of true love, and a captain who had loved her not for her title, but for the person she had always been. Far from the shadows of the throne, they had finally found something entirely their own. A life chosen freely, and a happiness with nothing left to hide. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I hope this story brought you warmth and emotion. What would you have done if you were in Miren's place? Would you give up a throne for a simple but genuine life with the person you love? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to read them. With love, Karina.